Welcome. I am starting off this celebration of my mom, Alice Darlington Hoffner, with some of her history and some of my favorite memories of her. It seems fitting to host this event in the barn where so many of her best memories were made and so much time was spent. Because I couldn't get through all of this without crying, I have asked my son-in-law, Josh Cook, who is a filmmaker, to do the taping ahead of time so that you can understand what I'm saying. I've known Mom the longest of anybody here except for her longtime friend Shirley, who's known her for 80 years. I imagine Shirley knows things about my mom that I was never privy to because you just don't tell your children everything. So sit back and relax. It's going to take some time to tell this story because Mom lived a full 97 years. And there is a lot of history and memories that I cherish about Mom, who was my best friend. She lived a long life, and I am trying to distill it down into 30 minutes. My mom, Alice Darlington Beam, grew up in a very privileged home in California with a mother who was a nurse and a father who was a doctor. She and her sister, who were only 13 months apart, fought like cats and dogs, and they had very different personalities. Jeannie was studious, extremely bright, and gifted with music talent that both her mother and father possessed. My mom, on the other hand, was not so inclined. However, what Mom may have lacked in those areas, she more than made up for with her vivacious personality, zest for life, determination, and ready smile. One of the activities the girls were enrolled in when they were young was a horse camp once a week. A car would drive around the neighborhood and pick up all the children and take them to the stable where a woman gave all the young people riding lessons. The bug bit Mom hard, and from that point on, she was crazy to have a horse of her own. Her father, looking for an easy way out, thinking his daughter was a little on the chubby side, said, "If you lose 20 pounds, I'll buy you a horse." In short order, Mom was 20 pounds thinner, and she had her horse, a little mare named Nina. This started the horse fever that would remain with Mom for the rest of her life. As Mom became older and started noticing boys, there was a very handsome boy she was attracted to, who also had a horse. He was attracted to Mom's very stable home life because his wasn't. And he spent a lot of time at the Beam home, and they rode their horses together on the Pacific Palisade trails. One night, Mom snuck out of the house to take a moonlight ride with this boy. And she said it was very romantic, but also very innocent. And when she returned, the house was ablaze and her parents were searching high and low. She was in deep trouble. The boy was Dare Harris, who later changed his name to John Derrick of 10 Commandments film fame and husband to Bo Derrick and other starlets. I always said Mom was his first flame. Then World War II happened and Mom's happy-go-lucky world changed. Many of her high school boyfriends went off to war. Japanese American children that were in her class were suddenly no longer there. And a little flower shop that was operated by a Japanese couple also closed. Life was very uncertain. The local racetrack also closed, and as a result, there were several thoroughbreds for sale. Mom convinced her father to buy her one of these horses. I ought to mention here that her parents knew nothing about horses, and so they weren't the best judge of the appropriate horse for their daughter. So they went ahead and purchased the thoroughbred Arctic Bird. But a short while later, the horse threw her and broke her back severely, and she was in a body cast for 6 months. For most people, that would have been the end of their riding career, but not for Mom. When recuperating, she read a book, Drinkers of the Wind, which was about the relationship the Bedouins of Arabia had with their horses. From that point on, she was determined to get an Arabian stallion when she recovered. Luckily, this time, she purchased a very gentle Arabian stallion named for Sam, and with the help of the man selling the horse, he became a very reliable mount, and she even rode him in the Rose Bowl parade. A family trip to a dude ranch in California inspired my mom to live on a ranch. And her father, ever the dreamer, considered buying one near Monterey, California. Sadly, he didn't end up buying it. So for Mom, fulfilling that dream would take a little more time. As the war came to a close, a handsome officer was stationed in the Los Angeles area awaiting discharge orders. Since the soldier's mother was related by marriage to Mom's family, the Beams invited him to dinner, and shortly after this meeting, my mom was engaged to be married to my father, Ivan Russell Turner. They were married in March of 1945, and that's when she was introduced to the town of Nunn. Needless to say, this was a bit of a culture shock for Mom. She left the temperate climate of Southern California and affluent lifestyle she had known and was transplanted to the small town of 200 people, Nunn, Colorado. It took a while to adapt to thunderstorms, blizzards, and to the ever-present wind. A home was built for the new couple on the farm her husband owned with his brother. But following the war, building materials were scarce, and the home was built of cinder brick, and she had orange crates for cupboards. A load of used furniture was delivered by her parents to help furnish the home, and thus began her life in Colorado. As often happens, dreams don't always materialize how you envision them. Farming was a bit different than the ranch life she was picturing, especially dryland wheat farming, which couldn't always be expected to yield a crop each year. It always depended. It depended on whether there was rain and whether or not the rain you'd been waiting for contained hail and wiped out your wheat crop. Financially, there were struggles, but she became busy raising a family and helping on the farm and soon adapted to her new life. Being able to bring her horse for Sam to the farm from California also helped. Jay was born a year after she moved to Nunn, and I was born 5.5 years later. John was born 12 years after me. When Sam died, she took another trip to California with me in our old Plymouth, pulling a one-horse trailer and purchased another stallion, Furtifar. I was only 5, but I remember the trip very well because I got a new coloring book, which I whipped out immediately as soon as we left the farm. I believe she tried to drive straight through to California because I don't remember staying in any hotels. And once she had to pull over to the side of the road to take a nap because she was too tired to continue to drive. We had food in the car, and I don't remember stopping for food either. I would crawl in the back and make sandwiches, and we would eat those as we drove. If you saw the rig we drove to California in, you would understand that this was a pretty daunting task for a woman alone with a 5-year-old child in tow. The car was old, and the trailer was a one-axle wood trailer with no top. I think, as I recall, my dad came to meet us on the way back because I think several people had told them they couldn't believe that they had sent her off to do this job by herself. This stallion that she purchased was not as easy as her first. He threw several horsemen that tried to help her get him broke. However, my mom was determined and found deep plowed fields, wore him down, and with miles of riding, he became a very reliable horse and a very winning show horse for both her and myself when I was a teenager. During this time, my mom and dad helped found the Colorado Arabian Horse Club. As a child, you are wrapped up in your own world, and I never really knew that my mom, after 22 years of marriage, was unhappy in her marriage to my dad. However, they did divorce, and in 1967, she married Russell Pollock. He was divorced and living on a ranch further east of town. This was the ranch that Mom dreamed of, and although it might not have been for everyone. The house was built in the 1900s and was the original homestead, which had built as a temporary structure on the section line for 2 families to prove up during the Homestead Act. Russ grew up in this home and became partners with his parents, sending money home to keep the ranch afloat during his service in World War II. After his parents retired and moved to town, the ranch house was a place for Russ to stay only when he was calving. He had not bothered to get electricity or plumbing because the cost for it was very steep, and he lived in town. However, when he divorced, it became his permanent home. Most people, including my mom, referred to it as a shack, but she loved it just the same. It was small and cozy and full of history. Once married, Mom and Russ set about making it more comfortable. However, they still weren't able to put in plumbing or electricity due to the cost. Therefore, my brother John and I learned how to live in a house lit by kerosene lanterns, drinking and bathing in water brought in from the well in buckets, and visiting the outhouse when nature called. It was very Laura Ingalls-like, but I didn't mind because there was happiness in the air and lots of laughter. Mom had found her forever home for the next 61 years, and even after building the new home in 2004, she often went out to the old house to sleep or read because it was quiet and full of good memories. Russ was interested and encouraged Mom in her dream to have an Arabian horse business, which they named Magneterra Arabians. My mom had a good eye for horses, and they bought some very nice mares and bred them to some prominent Arabian stallions in the Arabian horse industry at the time. One of the offspring, Magneterra Czar, was especially promising and won championships at an early age. The plan was to keep him as one of their key sires. During my first year of college, my mom called me and was crying because the bank was going to shut them off and not loan any money for operating. Russ had been borrowing money every year to fund the cattle and horse operations, which he would pay off in the fall after selling his calves. This particular year, the banks were very hard on farmers and ranchers and were not loaning money for operating as they had in the past. The banker had told them that even though Russ and Mom liked to have their pretty little horses, it wasn't a business and he wasn't going to loan them money. A hard decision was made, and Mom and Russ decided to sell Czar. His bloodlines were in demand, and being he was one of the few pure Polish Basque sons in the country, he brought $25,000. That figure in 1975 would have bought and paid for a house today that would be worth $400,000. The banker changed his tune when Russ brought in the check and never questioned their pretty little horse business again. Czar's photo hung in the ranch house along with a copy of the check for many years, since he was the horse that saved the ranch. One of the horses they bred was Magneterra Raja. The stallion became one of Mom's favorite riding horses, and the two of them competed successfully in dressage, which wasn't easy as Arabs were not considered the standard dressage horse of the time, and they still aren't. However, she rode him through second-level dressage and was invited to the first ever national championship, where he was named top 10. She also rode him in competitive trail and cross-country jumping. Today, there are still a few people who were showing with us in the 80s who remember the beautiful white Arabian stallion. When Russ became ill with cancer in 1982, she leased Raja out to stand at stud, and Raja died while he was there. She always regretted her decision to let him go because she said having him would have been healing after she lost Russ in 1984. Mom always had an interest in art of any kind. She was into photography when first moving to the ranch, and she had a small darkroom in the old ranch house to process her pictures, and did even some commercial work at the time. During the time Russ was sick, she turned her attention to sculpting so she could be in the house more. Her artistic flair created some wonderful pieces of art, and she even had 4 of her pieces cast in bronze. Casting was expensive, so she turned her artistic talent to pottery and had a small studio built with a kiln and painting equipment. We had a lot of fun taking watercolor classes and playing around in her studio. We recently framed her pictures and have several of them in her house and her studio. Prior to his passing, Russ was concerned how Mom was going to make it on her own, and he decided to sell off some of the land so that she wouldn't have to rely on the bank to loan her money. Fortunately, Mom's best friend, Shirley, was interested and purchased the land, allowing Mom to own the remaining 840-acre property outright when he passed. This began the 11-year period of Mom living and operating a cattle ranch and a horse business all by herself. I really marvel not only for the physical aspect of the work she did, but also for living on the ranch most of the time by herself. It gave me a greater appreciation for her independent spirit. Granted, she had Russ's kids, Nick, Doug, and John's friends and my family to help with the branding and gathering, but the regular chores were taxing. In her daily journal during this period, she questions why she's so tired. I think that's pretty easy to explain. Once I decided to take time off from my nursing job to come and help her with calving for a week. It was early spring and very cold. One night during that week, we had a cow in trouble, and she needed to pull the calf. She had a calf puller, but it needed both of us to get the job done. We were finally successful, but we had 2 other calves that were in trouble because it was so cold and they weren't responding. So we loaded all 3 calves up in the Pathfinder and drove them to the house, opened the door on the oven, and warmed the kitchen up, and slowly these calves all came back to life. While I wasn't at the hospital, I did feel kind of like I was in the intensive care nursery that night, and it gave me a whole new appreciation for the things that Mom was trying to do by herself. During this time, she was also getting help from her longtime veterinarian, Larry Hoffner. He would help whenever Mom had a problem that seemed overwhelming and look out for her, giving her advice if he felt like she needed it for her own safety. One such time occurred when she was very frustrated trying to catch cows in her chute so she could treat them. They kept escaping and she was in tears. Larry identified the problem as the equipment she was using, and he brought his portable chute out for her to use until he needed it for veterinary work. After finding it so much more effective and the answer to her most vexing problem, she gave him a great big hug of appreciation. Thus began the courtship of her 3rd husband, and they were married in 1995. His proposal is still written on the chalkboard of the feed room. The land that had been purchased by her friend Shirley was sold back to Larry when he sold his vet clinic in Fort Collins, a decision that Shirley called a no-brainer, and truly exemplifies the wonderful friend that Shirley was to Mom. It allowed Mom and Larry to put the ranch back together the way it was before Russ died. Larry took over the cattle operation, and this allowed Mom to spend more time with her horses. One spring in her early 80s, she called and told me that she wanted to take a trip to Kentucky to look at a horse. Someone had suggested that a gated horse would be easier on her joints. When I told her I could probably get time off in the fall, she said, "That'll be too late. I only have so many summers left." Little did she realize that she would had another 20 to go and would outlive the horse that she bought on this trip. Cody, as a gaited horse, had 2 speeds, walk and gait, which is great for trail riding. But she found she really missed the trot and canter when riding him. I was competing in dressage at the time, and she wanted to get in on the fun. So at 85, she started surfing the internet for a dressage horse and became obsessed with an unbroken gray 2-year-old filly. So much so that she had purchased the filly and arranged for shipping without letting Larry know what she had done, afraid he would dissuade her from her decision. The filly arrived in terrible condition from her week-long trip from Martha's Vineyard on the East Coast, and any anger Larry felt in not being let in on her secret disappeared when he saw how disappointed in her warm blood she was. The mare, Katama, appeared ready for the glue factory, and she was very thin and almost near death. The mare survived, and after several months of proper feeding, turned out to be sweet, and after a few months with my trainer, she was ready for Mom to ride. Mom would take her saddle down to the Rocky Mountain Airport in Broomfield, pull up front, and put her saddle on the ticket counter and fly to Grand Junction to ride. One trip, she showed the mare in a training level class at our Grand Junction show, and many of my friends and myself cried as we watched her ride her horse so well. She was an inspiration to all of us. When Mom was 88, she decided to do her century ride, which is where your age and your horse's age add up to 100. Kat was only 5, and she had 5 years to go before meeting the requirements. Afraid she wouldn't live that long, Mom decided to ride my horse Bo, who was 15 and easily met the criteria. One of the women we rode with in the 80s, Janet Foy, was the judge at this show, which made Mom's ride even more special. Mom made many trips to Grand Junction during this time, and so many of my friends at our barn and at our dressage club became her friends. She was always interested in their horses and what they were doing, and always wanted updates about them when she'd go back to the ranch. Several of my friends agreed to come with me to the Cheyenne Dressage show so Mom could come watch, and she was so excited to host the group that came and watch every one of our rides. When my trainer pushed me to buy a new horse, I found a nice filly on the internet and showed it to Mom. She said, "Call them," emphatically. Mom did not want me to miss an opportunity to buy her. She was instrumental in the purchasing of my mare Twiggy because I was the first one to contact the people right after the ad hit. This photo was Mom and I waiting excitedly for Twiggy to arrive, and one of my favorite pictures of the two of us, both excited and knee-deep in our mutual passion. A year later, she decided to do the same thing, and at 90 purchased Sally Golightly as a project. She was so excited about getting her to ride her once she was broke. However, within 2 years, Mom would have a couple of strokes, which eliminated her ability to get on a horse by herself. She came to see Sally at the barn while she was in training several times, and one of these times, she was wistfully saying she wished she could ride her. Zeno, the owner of the barn, sprang into action, and before Mom knew it, he picked her up and she was on. She began to cry. She was so happy to be on the horse, especially this one that she felt had so much talent. Here she is at 92 riding Sally, which was her last ride. However, she continued to take care of her horses until she was 95, until which time she leased her mare Katama and I took over the care of Sally. When she was no longer able to have horses to ride and train, she turned her attention to dogs. When her dog Charlie died suddenly, she was grief-stricken and desperate to get another dog to fill the void. There was a failed trip to the pound where she almost purchased a dog, but at the last moment decided he would never make it on the ranch. 2 days later, she had the brilliant idea of buying 2 Aussie puppies instead. I wasn't excited about the prospect because all I had visions of was her tripping over the puppies and breaking a hip. However, they both turned out to be good dogs and respectful of her space, and entertained her when she didn't have horses to fill the void. She was always worried about the pups and where they were, unless they were laying right at her feet. With Larry's help, Mom was able to stay living at the ranch until her last conscious moment, for which I will always be eternally grateful. She loved looking out the window at the view and watching the cattle come back and forth. However, there was a limit, and when the tumbleweeds blew the fence down and the bulls started wandering around in her front yard, she was out there with her walker, chasing them away. Even though she happily hung up her apron and turned the cooking chores over to Larry, she wasn't happy about not having a horse to play with, and she often talked about buying another one. Her computer, which had been instrumental in buying horses over the last 20 years, started not working. Mostly it was user error. But on one of her better days this last year, she called me up, excited for me to look at a horse she had found on the internet. She couldn't figure out how to send me the link so I could see him, and I told her I would look at the computer the next time I came. In frustration, she said, "He'll probably be sold by then, and it'll be too late." An indication she was still a serious buyer. Although horses were a constant for her in her life and important to her, her personal relationships were also important. She could always be counted on as a good listener and sympathetic confidant. My husband frequently refers to much of her advice. One principle he is trying to adopt is a good one. People always have a story to tell, and they are more interested in telling their story than listening to yours. So listen, and you might learn something. I think it's good advice for us all. My children, when they were young, said they had a grandma kind of grandma, and then they had a Grandma Alice. A clear indication of the unique individual she was, and not your typical grandma. I'm going to close with a poem that speaks to my mom's soul. It was written by Jefferson Spivey, who rode his Arabian horse from coast to coast in the 1970s. I'll saddle up and I'll be free. I'll find a dreamer just like me. We'll ride where we have never been, and we'll be the drinkers of the wind. Thank you, Mom, for the joy and happiness you have brought to my world all these years. I hope your spirit is soaring and you're riding like the wind to places you have never been. We will all miss you more than tongue can tell.